It's Monday, 24th of April 1916. In Dublin, leaders of the Irish Citizens' Army assemble at Liberty Hall. Then, more rebels start to gather across various locations in the city, taking them under control. A small number move towards Dublin Castle, the centre of British rule in Ireland. Here, the first shot is fired as the rebels kill a police constable guarding the castle. Only a few hundred metres away, Podrick Pearse, one of the leaders of the uprising, reads the Proclamation of the Republic. It demands Ireland be freed from British rule. Over the next few days, Dublin became a war zone, as many Irish rebels, British troops and civilians are killed. By Saturday, the British have suppressed what came to be known as the Easter Rising. But this was only the start of a bloody conflict. A few years later, and the Irish War of Independence begins, civil war being fought throughout Ireland. By 1921, the war was over, and a year later, Ireland became a self-governing state, separate from Britain. But how did this rebellion come to take place? Who were the rebels fighting against British rule? And why have they given their lives for independence? Look at this chart. It shows Ireland's population over the last 700 years. For most of this period, the population is growing. But in around 1840, something happens. The population starts to decline. It continues falling and falling, year after year. Recently, it's caught up a bit. But today, Ireland's population is still lower than 200 years ago. This isn't normal. Compared to similarly sized European nations, only Ireland's population fell so dramatically. See, at this point, the Great Famine hit Ireland. In 1845, a disease travelled to the shores of the nation. That year, it infected a third of all Ireland's potatoes, which was the main staple of the Irish working class diet. A year later, it caused the near entire failure of the crop. Still under British rule, some support was offered, as soup kitchens and public work programmes were set up. But this wasn't enough. Britain still continued the export of other crops, dairy and livestock from Ireland, which could have fed the starving millions. They largely didn't see it as their problem to solve, as some British officials even blamed the Irish. As a result of famine and British inaction, by 1850 about 1 million had died, and another 1 million had emigrated. Could the memory of the potato famine, which had killed so many, have influenced the Irish rebels? These two economists wanted to find out.
In political economy and political science, one of the big questions are what are the drivers of rebellion and civil conflict? In this paper, what we do is to actually focus on the decision of becoming a rebel at the individual level.
The researchers began to look at data digitized by the Irish military archives.
They took the surnames of rebels and matched them to census data, which told them much more. Their gender, age, religion, and importantly, where they lived. And then they looked at data showing where in Ireland the famine had hit hardest. These two maps start to explain what they found. The first one shows the distribution of rebels. The darker the colour, the greater the percentage of rebels in the population.
Look to the northern counties like Donegal, Derry and Antrim, and the colour is light. There weren't many rebels from these areas.
But look in other areas and the story's different. For example, counties like Galway, Dublin and Wexford were home to a far larger number of rebels. This second map shows the area with more potato crop failure. These places were hit the hardest by the famine, and millions suffered. Whilst not true everywhere, many of the places hit hardest by the famine were the same places which had a large number of rebels 70 years later. But could this be a coincidence? Could it really be that rebels were thinking of the famine, which occurred decades ago?
We literally do a counting of how many times the word famine is present in Irish newspapers, in articles in Irish newspapers during the revolutionary period, 1916-1921. Indeed, there is a spike during that revolutionary period. And our idea is that, that it was a kind of a story that was told from generation to generation.
It's clear that the famine was at the top of people's minds. during the uprising.
People didn't rebel during the famine straight away because, of course, they didn't have the energy to do so. But the narrative and the memory of what had happened stayed.
So, the effects of the famine were long-lasting, influencing the struggle for Irish independence years later. Thank you to Gaia Narciso for her support as part of this project. Please watch further videos in our series delivered by Discover Economics, Cage Research Centre and the Centre for Economics, Policy and History.